Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Object Relations Institute lecture series. I'd like to speak to you about a topic, well, several topics today, but the one I'm speaking to you about right now is related to writers and what makes a writer. Being a writer myself, with many published books, many articles, and always working on different forms of writing and helping people with writing within the 45 years of my practice, always having writing groups and working with people who have writing blocks, I thought it would be interesting to share with you about my idea of what makes a writer from the inside out. Because some people define what makes a writer from external circumstances, particularly according to whether somebody is publishing. But I would like to give you a definition of a writer that relates to the internal world of the writer and what I see as the most meaningful view of the artistic aspect of being a writer, as opposed to a purely functional one. And that has to do with how the writer gets pleasure as he or she is in the writing process. And my definition of a writer is about whether you are experiencing what you're writing as you write it and evolving what you say as you're in the writing process, as opposed to coming from your head with some pre-programmed ideas of what you want to say. I mean, you may have a general idea, but of what you're intending to write, of course, but there's a big difference between going into writing through an idea in one's head or the idea of what one is going to say ahead of time, as opposed to the spontaneous evolution of writing and speaking your thoughts in writing as you're in the process itself. This is what makes writing a creative process. And my view of the writer is that from the inside out is someone who gets the pleasure of writing through evolving what the person wants to say as they're in the writing process, not pre-programming it from one's head. And I think that's a very important distinction that allows us also to be free of the external definition of writers in terms of publications. Of course, I publish a lot and I love publishing, but there are a lot of writers that are really talented and might just want to enjoy the process of writing and sharing it with people without going through all the issues of publishing. And they're the genuine thing in itself of what a writer is, someone who writes for the pleasure of expressing one's voice in the written word as one writes in the moment. So it's about being in the moment versus imposing a false self into the writing process by putting something in your head and being dominated by that. In fact, working with long-term with writers who have writing blocks, I found that what can stymie someone in the writing process is when they impose the idea of a plot, for example, on what they want to write, as opposed to allowing the evolution of the plot to come from the characters. This is actually a point I make in my book, The Compulsion to Create Women Writers and Their Demon Lovers, published by Routledge in 1993 and then ORI Academic Press in 2013. Again, this book deals with contrasting very well-known writers, and Charlotte Bronte I speak about as someone who evolved to have the character-driven form of writing as opposed to plot-driven. I contrast it with her sister, and I contrast it with her earlier writing. So evolving into the organic flow of allowing your feelings to develop a character and characters that speak and develop the plot, rather than imposing the plot and trying to force characters into it. Now, if somebody's writing something for very practical purposes, of course, they're going to have an outline and they're going to write what they have in their head. But that's not being a writer. That's just using the written word to communicate practical information. That's very different than being a writer. So what I'm saying today is that being a writer involves coming from the inside in the moment. And that's where the writer gets pleasure. That's why one wants to write as a writer. Being a lifelong writer, I know this to be very true, that you get the pleasure from evolving in the moment as you speak, allowing things to be expressed in your written word, shaping your words through your feelings, and letting characters, if you're writing about characters, evolve from within the feeling moment. That can create stories or novels, but also can create professional writing, because for me, I have the art of combining theory and clinical cases in very interesting narratives of clinical cases. So even though in my earlier days I used to play around with short story writing, my actual publications over the many decades of my practice in the field have been not with short stories, but with clinical vignettes and longer case studies that allow the dialogues of the clinical process to be a real interesting narrative like a short story. So in my particular form of art of combining that with theory, I get the same pleasure that makes me want to do it as a short story writer or a novelist. I get the pleasure from being in the moment, just like in the clinical moment, one is in the writing moment. Also, as an Argentine tango dancer, the moment is very much the essence of the improvisation of Argentine tango. So as a dancer, I feel it. But as a writer, I know it from the inside out as I write words. And needless to say, now we use computers rather than just the romantic writing on a piece of paper, but it's still the same applies. It's the pleasure is gained from the inside out of expressing oneself as one's in the moment of writing and allowing things to evolve. That's where the writer gets the pleasure, and that's what motivates the writer to keep writing. And that, in my view, is what makes the actual authentic definition of what a writer is. So just wanted to share these thoughts with you today, something that's dear to my heart as a writer and as someone who helps people with writing. I do individual writing consults. I have a monthly writing group. I had earlier weekly writing groups. People have published many things, books and articles, but they've also just enjoyed writing through my writing groups. And I've also done long-term psychoanalysis, helping people to work through blocks and impasses that relate to unconscious conflicts that hold them back in writing. And as they become more conscious of what's holding them back, that they might be going on against writing and other things that go back to the internal world with their early parent figures and authority figures, which form the internal editor that's too driven and they can oppose it, that creates blocks. But if they are just interested in allowing things to evolve and they can't do it, then we talk about, are they not going from the feeling and allowing the character to come as opposed to imposing through their head what they think they want it to be, and therefore getting stuck because they actually go on strike against the persecutory part that's driving them towards an image in their mind rather than allowing things to evolve from the moment in feeling and self-expression through feeling. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've enjoyed sharing these these thoughts